With the amount of stuff that happened during the 1994 season, it could easily fill one of those 23-episode American TV seasons or whatever they're called, because there was just so much happening that the writers would never be short of content, and it would be the easiest job they'd ever have. But unlike those American TV seasons, there wouldn't be 18 standalone episodes just to fill the contract, with maybe one story arc in the middle and then 3 episodes at the end to sort of round it out. This would be pure quality, as well as quantity. For real though, 1994 has Hollywood written all over it. There's people that could be goodies, there's people that could be baddies, there's twists and turns, there's grit, there's drama, there's comedy, there's tragedy. It's got everything. They might even have to change certain bits of it to make it more believable. There's a, well, we'll call it a film based off certain historical events where they actually had to change one of the characters. Well, I say one of the characters, one of the actual people in the film, if that makes any sense, because he was so evil in real life, they didn't think that it would be believable in the film. So, 1994. It seems excessive, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Now, this is where I'm put in a difficult position. I could tell you everything that happened, even though regular viewers will just sigh and skip ahead because they've heard it all before, don't blame you, or I couldn't recap it and then get complaints that I forgot to talk about something. That's how much material the 1994 Formula 1 season has provided through being what it was. It was like 1976, 2014, 2016, 2021, 1990, 1989 or 1982. One of those made for Hollywood types of seasons. But for this video, we're going into the second half of the 1994 season, where the heat is going to get cranked up. Metaphorically and, well, as you're about to find out, literally. It's July. The checkered flag has just descended on the British Grand Prix, and Damon Hill has achieved what his late great father never could: win the British Grand Prix. Graham never won the British Grand Prix, Damon never won at Monaco. It's one of those weird facts you might like to pull out of your trivia tank whenever you feel the need. But those celebrations had the shine taken off because Schumacher in the Benetton had just been disqualified from second place, so all the attention was on that. This has been covered in its own standalone video, but the Billy basic explanation is that Michael overtook Damon on the formation lap, led most of that lap, and then when the start had to be aborted due to Coulthard stalling his Williams, Michael did it again. There was a huge kerfuffle and the FIA decided to black flag Schumacher for failure to obey black flags. Like I said, I've covered it all before, I'll leave a card for you. So the FIA started mulling over the punishment for Schumacher, doing their investigations, reading reports, other bits and pieces, and also having to deal with the so-called Option 13 thing because at this time, Benetton was still delaying the FIA showing up to have a look at their engine control software and other bits and pieces. And I've talked about Option 13 more times than I care to count because it's such an interesting saga and one that will be debated until the end of time, and insults such as Senna widows, salty Brit and cheaters will be lobbed around by all parties. But some reckon that the 3-race ban might be to just sort of give an excuse to do something about the Option 13 stuff. Who knows? It's the FIA and it works in mysterious ways. But on the Monday or the Tuesday of the Raw Keeg lol meme, the FIA decided that they were going to hand Schumacher a 3-race ban for his actions at Silverstone. A 3-race ban would have dented his title prospects given that after the Monaco Grand Prix the Williams car had become less twitchy and a bit easier to drive and set up. You'd think, in some sort of massive dark twist of irony, the safety and rule changes brought about by Senna's accident at Imola might have actually helped Williams a bit. So the thinking was, no Michael on the grid means that Damon should, in that Williams, be able to score a massive chunk of points. And it was a lot of points to overhaul. Remember that only the top 6 scored points in these days, and it was 10, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1 for those places, and Schumacher had a 27-point lead over Damon. It had been 37 points, but Damon had clawed back 10 of those with his win at Silverstone. With Schumacher potentially gone for 3 races, Damon could enter the Italian Grand Prix 7 points in the lead. And this 3-race ban was going to start at the German Grand Prix. A Schumacher no-show when the crowds were turning up just to see Michael would have caused a bit of chaos. The Grand Prix was a total sellout and had been sold out since March. 140,000 people were expected through the gate on race day, so it could be around the 300,000 mark for the whole weekend. And the crowds were not happy that their new sporting hero had been told to stay away from the car and not being allowed to race. The unhappiness was causing a lot of concern. The crowds were leaving piles of wood near the circuit, and the authorities were worried that the Germans would start a few bonfires with this wood, and potentially end up starting quite the forest fire. The mayor of Hockenheim, faced with all this unrest and a mob setting fire to his forest, begged the FIA to let Schumacher race. But Benetton had a trick up its sleeve, and that was to simply appeal the decision. While under appeal, Schumacher was allowed to race, but they were still playing a little bit of a game of Russian roulette with what they were doing. They had V8 engines, so Hockenheim was going to be a track where they were going to suffer because Hockenheim was the power track's power track. Wings on the car were just for show more than anything. The Ford V8 was going to be down on power versus the Renaults in the two Williams cars and quite a bit down on the Ferrari V12s. Turning up to Hockenheim for a smattering of points would help them if the FIA decided to uphold the ban. They'd walk away with at least some form of damage limitation. That's outcome number one. They walk away with something just in case the FIA decides that Schumacher is banned for Hungary, Spa and Monza after delaying the ban thanks to the appeal, because Hungary and Spa suited the Benetton better. On the other hand, if it takes a while for the appeal to go through, it could mean that the Benetton is banned from racing at a track that it's good at. Outcome number two is the worst case scenario, that the FIA takes precedent from earlier in the season and triples the ban like it did with Eddie Irvine after he was blamed for the accident in Brazil. That accident almost saw Martin Brundle get his head taken off by Verstappen's car. Jordan had appealed that ban only to see it triple in severity, so there was the very real prospect that Schumacher's season was over, but unlikely. And then there's the best case scenario that the FIA just drops the issue entirely and allows Michael to carry on with no penalty other than the disqualification from the British Grand Prix, although the FIA also has precedent with Nigel Mansell in 1989, who committed the exact same offence and got a one-race ban, so really, they're dealing with the first option in terms of a realistic outcome. The tension at the track dropped a bit, but security was heightened because Damon Hill had been informed by his Williams team that a German newspaper had received a threat to the effect of Damon will be shot if he qualifies ahead of Michael. A number of people seem to think that I somehow should be blamed for his plight, Damon said. It could have been a prank, of course, but these days you never know, and we took every precaution. And this wasn't just an overreaction to one person sending one letter to one person or newspaper. The previous year, 1993, tennis player Monica Seles had been stabbed on court with a 9-inch knife by an obsessed Steffi Graf fan, who is, like Schumacher, German. So there was reason to believe that it could happen again, just in a different sport. Damon had to go in through a back entrance to the circuit and had to have an escort by Zarozas to and from the venue, as well as having someone guard his hotel room. I'm not making this up. The security was also stepped up for Gerhard Berger when he put his Ferrari on pole position on Saturday afternoon. 4 tenths back was the other Ferrari of Alesi, showing that the V12 really had a home on this particular track. Damon was third, only 100th behind Alesi, and Schumacher was 2 tenths back still. Being on an open-top car as fireworks, flares and klaxons went off didn't do much to ease Damon's nerves, but the attempt on his life wasn't carried out. And onwards to the race. It was Ferrari's first front-row lockout since 1990, and they were looking for their first win since 1990. Ferrari was in the middle of quite the barren patch, having not won a race in nearly 4 years, so they were pretty much on for winning this Grand Prix. So long as the V12s held up, obviously. Alesi might have had pole if not for his engine cover flying off at the S-curve, which explains his gap to Berger. The track was also slightly modified for this year. The third chicane had a tighter entry and had been renamed Senna, and the first chicane, while not having any major changes, was now called the Clark chicane, having been called the Bremskurve 1 since it was installed in 1970. When the race began, it was yet another mark on the carnage-filled season of 1994. Andrea De Cesaris hit Alboreto, taking them off on opposite sides of the track, and this also took out Zanardi. Up ahead, Hakkinen hit future teammate Coulthard that caused a melee that wiped out as many as 10 cars. Listed in the retirements as not completing a lap due to a collision were Hakkinen, Blundell, Frentzen, Irvine, Barrichello, Herbert, De Cesaris, Martini, Zanardi and Alboreto. Hakkinen would later pick up a ban for causing the biggest of the 3 separate incidents. Coulthard had his front wing broken in the chaos, and up towards the first chicane, Alesi's car broke down as the electrics went. Katayama had managed to get ahead of Schumacher and Hill in his Tyrrell, but Schumacher was able to get back in front by the second chicane. Into the third, Katayama and Hill tangled, with Hill getting bent suspension for his trouble. This elated the German fans. You'd think then that the race would have been stopped, because 10 cars were wiped out before the first corner, and Alesi had stopped just before the first chicane at, well, the fastest track on the Formula 1 calendar at that time. But no, there was no red flag. There wasn't even a safety car. Cynics among you would think that they didn't stop the race or bring out the safety car because Schumacher was now in second and Hill was in the pits getting his suspension fixed, but it is what it is. Despite the engine disadvantage, Schumacher was able to keep up with Berger thanks to having an absolutely tiny rear wing and running a little lighter on fuel, and Schumacher would enter the pits for his first stop on lap 13 of the 45 that were scheduled. He came out behind Verstappen, who let him through, and then Jos the Boss was in a couple of laps later. Verstappen entered the pits, drove into his box, and they started changing the tyres. When the fuel rig operator Simon Morley tried to put the hose on, it wasn't fitting properly, so as he took it off to try and have another attempt at putting it back on, the fuel didn't just trickle out, it sprayed out. Some of that fuel had spilled onto the hot exhaust of the Benetton and also the front right brake disc, and this was enough to set this fuel on fire. I watched the footage to see how long it took, and I've timed it. It's around 1.8 seconds from the fuel splashing to the time it ignites. Might be a little bit less, my reactions with the stopwatch aren't that good. Could have just used some editing software, but what's the fun in that? Anyway, it's made even scarier when you consider how much more tightly packed pit lanes were in those days, plus those two massive pressurised canisters that are in this photograph. I hope that's not oxygen in there. There's also a more harrowing picture of this incident that you've probably seen. It's of Benetton mechanic Paul Seaby completely doused in petrol flames like something out of an action film. Others who were injured include Verstappen, Morley and Wayne Bennett, with the latter having to stick his foot in a toilet because there was not enough cold water to go around. There's an Autosport article that has some images that are just insane. They're almost not real. Members of other teams ran to help. It was only 6 litres that sprayed onto Verstappen's car, but as you can see from the footage and the photographs, that's enough. Verstappen and Morley needed extended treatment, but other than that, there weren't any proper serious injuries. It also meant that Schumacher was effectively out of the race. Half of his crew was getting treatment for burns and the pit area was caked in foam, so he couldn't get fuel or tyres. His engine died on lap 21 anyway, so the car ended itself before the fuel tank could dry up. So what happened? Well, more cheating accusations were thrown around afterwards. All the fuel hoses contained a filter made by the French company Intertechnique, and it was alleged that Benetton had removed this filter, designed to restrict the fuel flow to an FIA-approved limit, and in doing so, Benetton would gain a competitive edge in the pit stops. This had been hinted at as early as Brazil when Senna had entered the pits first and then emerged behind Schumacher. It's reckoned that not having this filter installed to the hoses was saving Benetton about a second in the pit stops, and the allegations of cheating were piling up on Benetton and Schumacher over the course of the year. As mentioned, the Option 13 thing was still going on, and Charlie Whiting, along with the independent investigators LDRA, had found the smoking gun, if you want to call it that, of the launch control software in the Benetton ECU. This could be turned on through a laptop or using some sort of video game style cheat code. Not only were the Option 13 revelations being presented to the FIA World Motorsport Council, the FIA also wanted a little chat about this fuel flow thing. That meeting was brought forward to the 7th of September when the FIA sat down to discuss the disqualification of Schumacher from the Belgian Grand Prix, in what would be the first edition of Plankgate. So basically they were discussing the whole plank thing and the fuel thing at the same time. The FIA was close to throwing the book at Benetton for what had happened, especially since the fire could have been so much worse if not for the quick thinking of the mechanics in the pit lane. Not just the Benetton ones, but all the other teams that helped. The day before the hearing though, the LaRousse team gave Benetton a lifeline. They contacted the FIA and said that Intertechnique had told them to remove this fuel filter, and Benetton was under the impression that everybody had removed this filter with the exception of 4 teams. Who those 4 teams are, I don't know. Williams might be one of them. Now this is where things get confusing, because the FIA said that Benetton had not removed it to cheat, but they had removed it without the authorization of Intertechnique to gain an advantage. Maybe because Benetton weren't told to, but then found out through sheer luck that LaRousse had been told to by that manufacturer? Answers on a postcard, because that doesn't make sense. Because removed it without the authorization of Intertechnique to gain an advantage, isn't that still cheating? Benetton was found guilty, but they were spared punishment because of the fact that LaRousse had told the FIA that Intertechnique had told them to remove this particular fuel filter. So the plea mitigation, the mitigation plea was found valid, but they were still disqualified from the Belgian Grand Prix, which is a video I still need to do in the future. The thing is, the fire in the Benetton pit lane in that German Grand Prix distracts from the fact that Berger won that race ahead of the 2 Ligiers, who were able to take advantage of the attrition. This was Ferrari's first win since Prost won at Jerez in 1990, and Berger's first win in 2 years. Had Berger won without the fireball happening, it would have been a more popular victory than it was at the time, given that Berger had lost a good friend in Senna and a countryman in Ratzenberger a few months prior. Damon would be 8th and a lap down due to the collision with Katayama, whose throttle went on lap 6, so he was unable to take a bite out of the championship lead. Schumacher was then allowed to race at Hungary before the Belgian Grand Prix disqualification, and then missed out in Monza and Estoril as the FIA upheld the ban. Meanwhile, other than having quite valuable sperm, Jos Verstappen is pretty much known for this one thing. While he did suffer burns to his face due to his visor being up when he entered the pit box, the longer lasting effects are strange, which sometimes happens with burns. I was set on fire a couple of years ago. It's not nice. When Verstappen drinks wine, he can feel the burning, and the redness from it flares up from time to time. CB has since joked that when he started dating his wife, the only picture his future mother-in-law had of him was the one of him on fire. So somewhere in his mother-in-law's house was brother-in-law's wedding, sister-in-law's wedding, other daughter's boyfriend on fire. I would actually say it's one of my 3 earliest motorsport memories. The first is the wheel coming off the Minardi at Imola in that same year, the third is Brundle going over at Melbourne in 1996, and the second is this one. I remember watching it. I was only young, but I remember it, and it's one of those things that's played over and over because of the shock it caused to millions around the world. Thankfully, fireballs of this scale are rare. Yes, there was Pedro Diniz in 1996, which was probably about a year and a half later, and then there was Grosjean at Bahrain in 2020, or Sakir, whatever the name of the race was. So thankfully, even though we still have these 3 case studies, they're incredibly rare, and that's a good thing. So then, a look at the Verstappen fireball of 1994. If this has explained something that you thought was interesting, then a like on this video would be appreciated. And for more stuff from the channel, subscribe and get that bell on so you never miss out. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads at Patreon, and if you want to help keep the picture purchasing piggy bank topped up, then a link is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and affiliates. Or there's super thanks if you just want to do a one and done. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day, and goodbye.